I am the Training and Education Director at the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, and I am Dine from Northeastern Arizona. From a small community called Shanto. I'm really happy to be here with you all. The Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women is a collective working to prevent as well as end violence in tribal communities, as well as within Native families. We do have 4 core areas that guides our work, that also informs our work. The first is training, ensuring that our service providers are provided the tools and information that they need to do the best job they can in supporting survivors. We also provide education, technical assistance to folks who are needing technical assistance within their organizations or any type of capacity building to really help bring out the best parts of their program. We also focus on policy advocacy, keeping an eye on what's taking place nationally as well as within the state of New Mexico, within tribal communities, and how that affects the work that we do, and how can we elevate some of those really important policy changes. And lastly, and most importantly, is support. We make sure that the services that we have are tailored to support our advocates, to support folks who are working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and ensuring that the space here is specifically to meet their needs, as well as utilizing really innovative ways to address violence in tribal communities. Some of the areas we cover, one being sex trafficking, sexual violence, Native youth initiatives, and the missing and murdered crisis, focusing on land body violence, as well as extractive industries. More recently, we're also delving into areas of food sovereignty and looking at more dynamic ways to support community as a means of violence prevention. So today's event is going to focus on a couple of things. Today is the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. And it's really important for us to continue to elevate this issue, as it certainly does affect our tribal communities. It affects our Native urban areas, and it has a direct correlation to the missing and murdered crisis nationally, as well as here in the state of New Mexico. Additionally, we have Annita Lucchesi, who has done amazing work within the realm of the missing and murdered crisis, as well as trafficking, and is also a survivor herself. And we will also have Michele Curtis from First Nations Community Healthcare that will be joining us and providing us a direct service provider perspective. Additionally, Michele is actually going to be starting on Monday as our coalition's new sex trafficking project coordinator. So in her capacity with First Nations, it's only right that some of the last work she'll be completing will be with us, and then she'll be starting more amazing work with us on Monday. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Honey, if you want to introduce yourself and kind of go over some of the housekeeping items, if you'd like, in terms of the Zoom functions.
Hi, my name is Honey Sunday. If you guys could please rename yourself on Zoom so we could see your full name for attendance. If you feel uncomfortable or not know how to rename yourself on Zoom, send me a private message with your name, organization, and job title. And also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, title, organization, and tribal nation, if applicable. My name is Honey Sunday. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the project and media assistant. I support our coordinators here at CSBNW with trainings and presentations. I'm the Dine. My clans are Kia'ani and Tkachini. And I'm from Torreon, New Mexico, but I have lived in Albuquerque for a while. Before we begin, here are some housekeeping items to keep in mind. Please rename yourself on Zoom so we can keep attendance. Just your name and organization and job title. Please use the chat box for questions or comments. Feel free to use the Zoom reaction and raise hand function, which you will find on the bottom of your Zoom screen. CSBNW staff will be on standby if you have any questions. If Zoom happens to log you off, wait for a minute. If it does not come back up, please use the link we sent to you to sign back on. We apologize ahead of time. The material being presented may be heavy and could cause discomfort, so we encourage you to take care of yourself and utilize these recommended tips during the workshop. Be gentle with yourself and take breaks as needed. Keep water and healthy snacks nearby. Have medicines like sage, cedar, and medicine bundles nearby. Having grounding tools nearby also helps. Grounding tools could be items like Play-Doh, stress ball, fidget spinners, or having your pet around. Wearing comfy clothing is also comfortable. You may choose to use headphones if needed. Choose a spot where you are at, a spot that soothes you. For example, next to a window to look outside, your comfy couch. If you're driving, please be safe and get to a safe space so you may continue to be in the present with us. Engage in breathing and also engage in breathing exercises. I also want to say that I will be putting our evaluation link into the chat box later, like during the meeting. So just a heads up. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, honey. Really appreciate it. So with that, we can go ahead and go into the first part of our agenda. We understand that trafficking is an issue that's been around for, since 1492. If I think it's safe to say that. And we felt like it would be really good to kind of give a primer, just some basic foundational understanding of what trafficking looks like in tribal communities. And we'll spend about 10 minutes on that. If you have any questions, feel free to drop it into the chat box. Honey will let me know, and then we can answer those questions as they come in. So this will be just a very foundational primer in understanding what trafficking is. Let me share my screen here. Honey, can you see my screen?
Yeah, trafficking in tribal communities.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me pin myself so I can see. Cool. Okay. So this actually is a presentation that generally is over an hour long. So we're going to condense this into 10 minutes, but a lot of it's just going to be some very foundational knowledge. So when we think about trafficking, we also have to acknowledge the historical events that have taken place that has led to trafficking in tribal communities today. We understand that colonization is a structure and it's not an event, meaning that this isn't something that is a thing of the past, but it is an ongoing occurrence that continues today. And because some of those colonization efforts that were done through the system of white supremacy, through the system of genocide, led to a lot of these root causes of violence that are taking place in our communities. Of course, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit crisis. It led to the relocation of tribes, dislocating them from their ancestral homelands, removing them, and really displacing our relatives. It also led to the development of resource extraction, which led to violence within tribal communities. And it's also very much tied to consent. When we have resource industries coming into our communities without proper consultation or even just permission and no consent, that definitely translates to violence being perpetrated within our communities, especially to our young women and girls and our trans and two-spirit relatives. Colonization also incorporated many tactics with forced assimilation, as well as leading to systemic racism. Systemic racism is both structural and institutional, meaning that there's these different pockets of policies that were intentionally put within the systems we have at the very top level that have trickled down to communities that have really created a lot of dysfunction, getting in the way of the traditional ways of life that we had before. Some examples are the Indian Relocation Act, forced removal off of reservations, even the Dawes Act. Even though folks thought that getting an acre and a mule as an Indigenous person was a great thing, was a gift, it was not. That was just their way of being able to parcel out lands and slowly shrink away the land claims of tribes. It also led to rape culture and misogyny, patriarchy and gender-based violence, the sterilization of Native women, as well as brutality towards our LGBTQ trans and two-spirit relatives. In terms of sex trafficking, here is a basically straightforward definition of what that is and what it looks like. Sex trafficking occurs when someone is, sorry, I can't see this. Someone uses fraud, force, or coercion to force victims to engage in commercial sex acts for the benefit of someone else. When we say a commercial sex act, it can include things like money, it can include services. There have been instances where even children were being traded for food stamps or for money, for drugs, things like that. So we have to think in terms of a person being utilized as a commodity, their personhood, their bodies are being commodified and being utilized for sexual acts that are benefiting someone else who is collecting that money, who's benefiting in some sort of way. Also, what's really important to note is a minor, anyone who is under 18, is not a sex worker. They are not a prostitute. These are children who are being forced to commit sex acts, and it is illegal. So along with that, youth under 18 cannot consent to sex. So what we know here in the state of New Mexico, it really is hard to see what those accurate numbers are in terms of domestic and sexual violence, but we know that it occurs. Nationally, 84% of Native women are affected by violence, and more than 60% of crimes in New Mexico tribal communities are a result of sexual violence. 30% of Native trafficking victims say they were previously in foster care, which is just one of the vulnerabilities where our relatives who are victims of trafficking at times come from the foster care system as well. And here are some statistics relating to the missing and murdered Indigenous women cases. And like I said, I'm going to go through this, got about 4 minutes. Here's a really great quote by Sarah Deer, who is one of the amazing leaders nationally, Indigenous leaders nationally, who are leading the way to addressing sexual violence in tribal communities. Tactics of traffickers are consistent with many of the tactics used by colonial and American governments to subjugate Native women, girls, and LGBTQ+ relatives. This power and control is so deeply ingrained in American history that it is often rendered invisible and thus becomes normalized. So when we think about the systems that we have in place right now, especially now that we're acknowledging critical race theory, white supremacy, at a very large overall level, when colonization was happening, genocide, forced assimilation, forced sterilization, this was the first power and control model at a very large scale. For our advocates who work with survivors and that are very familiar with the Duluth model, it is basically the same model, just on a bigger scale. Sex trafficking victims can be anyone. Our male relatives can be trafficked. Whether that's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, it does occur. A lot of the times, victims of trafficking don't identify themselves as victims, only because they've been groomed by the trafficker, who have built either a bond or some sort of false trust that kind of allows the trafficking victim to think that it's a consensual relationship and engage in sexual acts for money, thinking that this is what their partner may want, or it's the right thing to do when it's not. So when we talk about trafficking, there are many times where trafficking survivors don't realize that they are actually a victim of trafficking. Sexual exploitation and trafficking can start at a very young age, as children or even young adults. I believe young girls under the age of 18, Native girls, the median age of trafficking is 14 years old. And that's really young. Of course, there's many avenues in terms of how traffickers prey on folks. It can be done in person. It can be done through social media. There's just several ways that traffickers are trying to be very dynamic when they are preying upon vulnerable folks. As mentioned before, traffickers do look at vulnerabilities of our relatives who are out there. They use grooming tactics, things like love and attention, utilizing gifts and appealing promises to the victim, trying to exemplify stability, promising things like we're going to be a family, we're going to get married, we're going to have a home, and promising things like money and a better life. When in actuality, the trafficker will engage tactics such as sexual, emotional, and mental abuse, confiscating important documents, withholding important information that belongs to the victim, even inducing or enabling drug addictions. Of course, they will also utilize violent techniques, sexual assault, and other types of scare tactics, maybe threatening their families. That is also another tactic that they utilize. So here in the state of New Mexico, some areas where we can identify where trafficking is taking place. It's safe to say it's taking place at our casinos, our truck stops, even large social gatherings. There have been reports where young girls are approached by non-Native folks at these social events like balloon fiesta, powwows, even at the shopping malls, as well as in the extractive industry areas where there are man camps like in Eastern Navajo. There were some cases out there where girls were being taken there, and of course through social media. Just want to do a quick time check. And this will be our last slide. Some of the effects on trafficking of Native persons. 79% of the victims that have been sexually abused as children by an average of 4 perpetrators. 92% of victims have also been sexually assaulted. And additionally, 52% of those victims have suffered PTSD at the time of being interviewed. 80% have utilized substance abuse services, and 98% were currently homeless or had been housing insecure. What I want to remind folks is, I know this is a lot of information and it can be very daunting. It can be very, taking some time to really take this all in. What I want to remind folks is that although this is occurring within our communities, we all have a role where we can really engage in prevention, having these conversations within our families, monitoring what our children are doing on social media, or even if you have a friend that might be saying, hey, I met this guy on Facebook and he's promising me this and that, and it's going to get me out of my situation. You can start to also recognize some of those grooming techniques that are happening. So another part of that too, especially as women, is situational awareness. It's really important that we're constantly protecting our bodies, but it's also okay to take those next steps for safety. Things like if you're leaving your home, kind of checking out the perimeter. If it's after dark, staying in more well-lit areas, maybe having your keys ready, or if you carry pepper spray, anything like that. But what I can say is that trafficking generally takes place by someone who's trying to groom and utilize those types of tactics. So just a little bit of food for thought before we move into our next part of the presentation. So with that, honey, if you want to introduce Annita, and we can go from there. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I got it. Our next presenter is Annita Lucchesi. She's Cheyenne, serves as the Executive Director of Sovereign Bodies Institute, and in that role continues her work as a founder and caretaker of the MMIW database, She brings years of experience in grassroots research and organizing to end violence against Indigenous women and girls, and has served as advocate and an expert in work with tribal, federal, and state efforts to better address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Annita is a survivor of domestic and sexual violence, as well as trafficking. Her research specialty includes Indigenous mythologies, art-based methods, critical cartography, and data sovereignty. She holds a BA in geography and from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MA in American Studies from Washington State University, and is currently pursuing a PhD in geography with a minor in gender and women's studies from the University of Arizona.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to share today. I want to start by apologizing that I'm joining from a car. You can clearly see I'm sitting in a car. I'm at my family's house on the res, and there's way too many kids and people in that house to have a kind of quiet, private space. So I thought it would be best to just join from the car in the driveway. I'm joining today from my Cheyenne homeland in Busby, Montana. I travel back and forth, kind of live a triangle life between Arizona, Northern California, and Southern Montana. But as was mentioned, I'm pursuing my degree in Tucson, Arizona. And a lot of my community-based work is here in Montana. Planning on moving back up to Montana soon. So that's a little bit about kind of where I'm joining from today. As was mentioned, I'm Cheyenne. I'm a survivor of domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking. And I also work as director of Sovereign Bodies Institute, and in that role oversee our organization and steer our work. And I also am a direct advocate for families and survivors who need our assistance navigating the legal and judicial systems. We provide direct services to Indigenous survivors of violence and MMIP families all over the United States and Canada. And also provide support services and assistance to folks throughout Latin America as well. We recognize indigeneity in all of its forms at Sovereign Bodies Institute and don't allow colonial borders to define the scope of our work. So that's a little bit about SBI and kind of the perspective that I bring to this conversation as both a survivor and as an advocate. Right now there's over 200 families and survivors that I've am actively in contact with and working with in various capacities on their cases. I apologize, I'm also getting a little sick, so if you see me do this or sneeze, I'm here. I'm just a little under the weather. And so my experience is based on years of experience kind of at the grassroots and level with working directly with families and survivors and as a service provider. But I've also taken an active role in shaping the national dialogue on broader issues like data on this crisis, what effective policy interventions might look like, and really how from a kind of zoomed out level, how we might think about how to address issues like trafficking or MMIP. So today, I had initially planned on having some slides for you guys, and I reflected on that and decided that I wanted to be a little more, I'm not sure what the right word is, maybe authentic, a little more personal about what I share today, both as a survivor and as an advocate and a researcher. So today I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about my story. I'm also going to share a few other stories of cases that I've worked on or that I am working on in that in that portion of my remarks, I'm not going to share any identifying information unless it's a family that has already indicated that they're comfortable with that. So there will be some examples that may be kind of anonymized. And then I'll talk briefly about the kind of services that SBI offers to survivors of trafficking, as well as MMIP families impacted by trafficking, and where I think kind of the future of our work to address these issues should be. So to start, one thing that I say, and if you see me looking down, it's because I have my little mini car smudge bowl in my hand right here. So thank you to the instructions in the beginning to have something grounding. Cedar is definitely grounding for me, and that's what I have here. To start, pretty much every stereotype that you can imagine about trafficking was not present in my experience. And that doesn't mean that they don't happen or that there's not some valid truths to, some of the predominant narratives, but it definitely wasn't my experience. I think there's a lot of unfortunate stereotypes out there that, say that, people are getting kidnapped by vans in Walmart parking lots, or, have barcodes tattooed on them. And none of that happened to me. And none of that has ever happened to anyone that I knew when I was trafficked, or even, other survivors that I've met later on in my life. It wasn't, there, instead it was, as was mentioned, a relationship that kind of grew and shifted over time, and was characterized by a lot of normalized violence and a lot of desperation. So my trafficker was, my partner, and it didn't start out bad. It started out pretty wonderful. We were both sober. We had a little home together and a dog, and we were, building our lives together. I was in school. He was building his own career, or trying to, and everything was okay. And things fell off. The train came off the tracks when he relapsed and started drinking really heavily. And I had left to go visit my family for a little bit, and I came back, and his grandmother that had raised him had passed, and he had relapsed with relatives who were actively using, and eventually was drinking so heavily that he started using drugs as a way to continue to drink without falling asleep, and it just kind of spiraled from there. And this was a person I loved very much, that I empathized with, that I was committed to. I saw all the ways that colonialism had impacted him and his family over time. I saw all the things that he had been through. He had very complex PTSD, honestly, the worst PTSD I've ever seen in my life, which is, even to this day, that really says something, because I work with people with PTSD every day. But he really struggled and was not getting treatment or support, didn't feel safe going to mental health providers, didn't feel safe asking for help, had good reason to be terrified of law enforcement, and was just really lost. And so I stayed thinking, maybe I could help him. Maybe I could get him in a ceremony. Maybe there was some way that we could get things back together. And it took me a long time to realize that that's something I couldn't do, and to accept that. And in the meantime, we were failed by essentially every system that people assume catches people in situations like that. So law enforcement solicited me, and he and I would be walking down the street, and they would pull over and ask me how much I was, and because they knew who he was and what he was doing, or we would go to motels and they'd ask him, how many hours do you want the room? And they, they knew what was going on. That motel to this day is still a brothel. Um, and there'd be times where he was under Department of Correction supervision. So his parole officer or his DOC officer would come to the house a few times a week. And, this is the racism of the system. He got a parole violation for, our house was on an alley. So there's, people walking up and down that alley all the time. And there was an unopened beer bottle in the backyard next to the alley. And even though he had no substance use related offenses, they said Indians aren't supposed to drink. And they put him in jail for 2 weeks for that unopened beer bottle, which clearly he hadn't drank because it was unopened. And on the flip side of that, there were times where they would come to the house and there'd be, Annita sized holes in the wall and, bruises or injuries or, all sorts of evidence of abuse. And they looked the other way every time. And when I left him, he was having a severe psychotic episode because of the PTSD, and it got to the point where I couldn't stop him from hurting himself or others. I mean, I had buried all the knives in the backyard. He had dragged us into the street, was hoping cars would run us over. He was trying to fight the neighbor's dog. He was trying to fight his cousins. He, and all of his family said, I give up. We're leaving him with you. You figure it out. He'll snap out of it eventually. I mean, it had been all day. And I said, I'm not physically strong enough to hold him back. Like, you can't leave me like this. And they left. And he was having seizures really bad. So I called 911 for the paramedics, and they strapped him to the gurney. And when he was on the gurney, he woke up and looked at me like he just, was never going to forgive that. And like, something bad was going to happen. And so I left, and I didn't leave because I valued myself. I left because I didn't want him to go to prison for killing me. And I thought that's what was going to happen if he got out of the hospital and he found me at the house. And those EMTs there, they saw injuries of mine. My hand was broken at the time. I was covered in cigarette burns on my legs. And I had bite marks on my face and my legs that were infected. I was missing chunks of my hair. I couldn't smile with my mouth open because I had wounds in my mouth that would make my mouth bleed if I stretched my cheeks or my gums too much. I was clearly not okay, but the EMTs and the police who came did nothing and said nothing. And they took him away and they said, well, we're going to keep him for sure for 24 hours. And I didn't believe them. My gut told me that wasn't going to happen. So shortly after they took him away, I packed everything I had and I put it in a taxi, whatever I could grab. And I didn't even have money for the taxi. I finally, I'm blessed. Many people who experience abuse or trafficking don't have someone to call. I'm blessed that I had family to call, that had money and resources to help me. Taxi, and they paid for a motel room for that night. Sure enough, a few hours later, he had broken out of the psych ward and he ran 10 blocks from the hospital to our house in his socks, looking for me, and spent the next few days driving all over the city looking for me. And so I hid out in that motel room for days. I didn't eat for days. And then, again, I was very blessed to have family with resources, and they got me on a plane ride home. But I didn't want to leave. I didn't want it to be over with him. As Jolene mentioned, I didn't understand myself as a victim of trafficking. I knew that I was a victim of abuse. I knew that he was a victim of abuse and trafficking as a child. And I empathized so much with him and all of the things that he had been through and all of the struggles that he had, and all of the trauma that he had that wasn't his fault. I I really didn't blame him. And to this day, you know, after years of healing, this was about 6 years ago when I left. After years of healing, um, you know, I'm able to look back and see, you know, yeah, here was an opportunity for healing that he had that he didn't take, and that is his fault. Or here was an opportunity where he could have done something different and he didn't. I am able to see those a little clearly now, but even to this day, I blame the system much more than I blame him. And not just, you know, the carceral system, the prison system, police. Um, I I blame the school system, you know, for he didn't learn to read until he was sentenced to prison as an adult at the age of 15 for offenses related to being trafficked. Um, and his social services file is, you know, the size of a book. You know, the foster care system, the school system, the juvenile justice system. There are all these things that are supposed to be in place to make sure that our youth are, you know, having their needs met and are safe and are getting support. And none of those did that for him. And he grew up in a world where violence and sexual violence and abuse was very normal, not just within his family, not just within his tribal community, but you know, because of the way the system responded to those instances of violence. Um, and you know, it makes sense that he thought that trafficking was normal. It makes sense that he didn't even think of it as trafficking because his entire life he had been told that it wasn't and that it was okay. And so, you know, there's that broader system complicity, but then even leading up to the actual violence that I experienced with him, you know, police were complicit every step of the way. And you know, to the point where at one point someone had called the police on the house that we were staying in, and said, hey, there's something not right there. A neighbor who had seen me getting beaten in the driveway, and the police came to the house with guns drawn, pointed at my face, with no warrant. And you know, so how was I supposed to feel safe talking to them? How was I supposed to feel safe asking for their help? And they later ended up shooting and killing someone I knew in the back, you know, for shoplifting. So there was already a culture of unsafety. And when I left, his DOC officer actually called me and asked me to go back to him because he knew I was his source of financial stability. So to this day, I still believe the system. I blame the system more than I blame him, I guess is what I'm saying. And so the reason that I'm sharing all of these details today, and I realize that they may be kind of triggering, is that I think for people to understand the actual landscape of what trafficking looks like, it's not that our systems are ignorant or unaware, it's that they're actually complicit and creating this violence and allowing it to happen and taking part in it. And that for many Indigenous people who, you know, at least have a story like mine where they're trafficked by someone who is also Indigenous, you know, which is fairly common. Most trafficking survivors are victims of trafficking by someone they know, you know, an intimate partner or a family member. And many times those people are Indigenous. Um, there's a broader landscape of complicity. I think when people hear of issues like man camps or extractive industries, they kind of make the casual assumption that, oh, that means the workers must be trafficking them or the workers must be buying them. And yes, that does happen, absolutely 100%. However, it's not the predominant experience. Instead, it's usually something like what I experience. And that doesn't mean that it's not attached to extractive industries. My trafficker was from a reservation that was impacted by an oil boom when he was a child. He grew up seeing his mom being trafficked and abused, and seeing, you know, sexual violence and also an influx of drugs and gang violence and all sorts of other violence because of the man camps and because of the oil boom that his community had experienced. And it completely wrecked his childhood. And, you know, really his whole life and the lives of a lot of people around him. So even though I wasn't raped by a man camp worker, even though I wasn't, bought by a man camp worker. And I wasn't even living on that oil field when I was trafficked. I am part of the social collateral damage that that industry has caused through that kind of generational and geographic ripple effect. So that's kind of the level of nuance or complexity that I think we need to have when we talk about trafficking. And I realize, I'm taking up a lot of my time talking about my story. So I also want to share a little bit about some of the other stories that I see or things that I think are important for people to walk away with. The majority of trafficking cases that I work on are MMIW cases. Very rarely do we have a survivor asking for help. Usually it's a family asking for help because their loved one is missing or murdered. And most frequently, lately, cases have been originating in places like Montana and South Dakota, but often entail interstate travel. So Billings, for example, is kind of a hot spot for that. And we've had several cases where young women have been taken to Billings by somebody who they believe is a boyfriend, and eventually taken to places like Las Vegas, Phoenix, Seattle, or Los Angeles. Those have been the kind of primary destinations, and sold out of Billings to those locations. Again, the system is absolutely aware of this because all 4 of those cases went through the same motel in Billings, a motel that was recently shut down because of its involvement in trafficking. But that took years of advocacy and years of work and the lives of quite a few young women for the city and local authorities to actually do something about it. And still to this day, there haven't been any arrests or convictions attached to it. Again, yet another example where it's pretty clear what's going on. There's repeated examples of it, and the system looks the other way, and not just the system, but our own people. I really think that, as MMIW becomes more of a trending topic and trafficking becomes more of a trending topic, we need to have some hard conversations within our own communities about how we treat each other. And that includes, survivors of trafficking, survivors of, sex work in general. We're made to feel dirty and damaged our entire lives. It doesn't matter how much we contribute to our community. It doesn't matter how much we turn our lives around. We are always made to feel like, oh, remember she did that 20 years ago in Vegas? That never goes away. That's something that, don't be posting about MMIW if you're going to say stuff like that, because you don't really care about our women. You don't really care about survivors of violence. If you're going to engage in that kind of lateral violence against our own people, make our people feel safe to come home. Make our people feel cherished and sacred and loved, regardless of what's happened to them. A lot of the women and girls that I've seen, both as a survivor and as an advocate, who have been trafficked are from, quote, bad families. And, people from Native communities know what I mean by that phrase. Families that have a reputation for, struggling maybe with substance use or unemployment and poverty. Families that, have a lengthy interaction with, maybe child protective services or the prison system, and criminalization. Families that have a lot of intergenerational trauma and a lot of cycles of abuse. Those women and girls from those families get left behind like they're trash. It teaches them that it's okay to look for love in all the wrong places, and that what happens to them in these motels by these men who say that they love them is normal and okay, because that's the only love they're getting. And they don't feel welcomed and cherished and loved by their own community. And that certainly was the case, for me as a survivor, because I wasn't connected to my community at that time. The other Native women that I saw on the street were also felt less than, and felt more loved on the street than they felt on their own reservation or in their own community. So as we think about how to address this crisis, I think a big part of it is really looking critically at ourselves to see what kind of environment we're building in our own communities that values all of our women and girls, not just the ones who, may be academically successful or, deeply involved in cultural activities or whatever. All of our women and girls, all of them, whether they come from households that use, whether they've experienced violence as a child, whether they're acting out in school, or it doesn't matter. All of our women and girls, all of our people are special and sacred and have a role in our communities. And until we change our mindset to reflect that and change our behavior to reflect that value, trafficking will continue to happen. And I realize, I'm short on time, so I just want to close by talking a little bit about the services that SBI offers, and then, we'll transition over to the next speaker who can speak in more detail on services. We have a 24/7 crisis line available at Sovereign Bodies Institute. The number is 707-335-6263. You can call us, you can text us. You do not need to be in the US. You do not need to be an enrolled tribal member. If you are Indigenous, you are eligible for services with us. We don't really have like a menu because every survivor needs something different. Every family needs something different. And we try to meet folks where they're at. So if you call us for help, the initial conversation will be us listening to you, hearing, what you're going through, what your needs and priorities are, and then we'll kind of triage and make a plan to address those needs and priorities. Essentially, the only two things that we don't offer are medical care and legal representation because we're not doctors or lawyers, but we can make referrals to those as best we can as needed. In terms of what we are able to provide, it's emotional support, case advocacy as, liaison with law enforcement and with the press, help navigating the judicial system and the legal system. We have free teletherapy with Indigenous therapists. We offer emergency financial assistance as well as long-term financial assistance to families and survivors who qualify for that. And there's no, income threshold for that. It's not based on financials, it's based on need. And so sometimes that includes rent, utilities, other bills, medical care. We have quite a few clients who are grandmas raising grandkids because the parent is missing or murdered. And in those cases, that's kind of some long-term financial support that includes things like childcare and school supplies and Christmas presents and Easter baskets and groceries. And we really try to think holistically about what taking care of our people means, with the understanding that our work to address this crisis through advocacy and through research and policy design and program design, those things are all going to be stronger when our people are stronger and well taken care of. And when we fully understand their needs and priorities, because we're the ones working as holistically as possible to address them. It's my biggest point of pride that people feel safe coming to SBI and feel safe coming to me asking for help, because it's very hard for Native people to ask for help. That's what we're there for. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And also I want to encourage everybody who's listening. We do have a truly amazing group of women made up of in our Survivors Leadership Council. There's 9 of us Indigenous women who are all survivors of trafficking or survival sex work. They've done some really incredible, informative webinars that those recordings are available on our Facebook page and on our website, sovereign-bodies.org. I really encourage you to listen to them and learn from them directly. Survivors have so much expertise and so much leadership and good thoughts to offer that it's important to hear from survivors ourselves. So please do check those resources out. And Ash, thank you for allowing me to share today.
Yat everyone. I hope everyone's doing well, and of course to be in you're in a safe space to talk about trafficking and the violence against the women, children, men, and of course LGBTQ community. So today I'm going to be talking about resources and direct services. So I'm going to start my presentation. I was formerly a direct service provider for human trafficking victims. So today I'm going to talk about the resources we use and what First Nations Community Healthsource provides for human trafficking victims. You can, next slide, honey. So what is human trafficking? It's just what Jolene and Annita talked about. There's sex trafficking, which is a variety of venues within the sex industry, including brothels, escort services, fake massage businesses, strip clubs, and street prostitution. And then there's labor trafficking, which is diverse labor settings, including domestic work, small businesses, large farms, and factories. Next slide. So what does human trafficking look like in tribal communities? As being a direct service provider, I feel like we are the front lines, the first responders to trafficking victims here in Albuquerque. You know, they don't have many resources. And so what I always talk to my clients and I tell them, you know, so tell me, you know, the situations you've been through. So they tell me that family members traffic them. There's an increase of women in the LGBTQ community that come into Albuquerque during powwows, the state fair. Then they use the casinos. Also, and as you know, there's many casinos around here. And of course, non-natives come in and they would take advantage of our native relatives. And of course, substance abuse also. A lot of the time, the traffickers prey on our native relatives, and how they, you know, try to keep them coming back is they get them addicted. So substance abuse is a role in trafficking because these victims are they never used drugs before, but you know, the traffickers start their addictions. Next slide, honey. So I work closely with the transgender resource community of New Mexico, and a lot of the time the transgender community are overlooked. You know, they are victims of trafficking also, and here I listed, oh, and male relatives. Here I listed what these victims go through, which is homelessness, substance abuse, gender-based violence, sexual violence, and mental health. And I say about a high percentage of the clients I serve are unsheltered relatives on the streets. And, you know, they don't have their documentation. So as a case manager, we would help with that, and getting their ID, birth certificate, even their CIDs. And with mental health, they've been through so much trauma that people overlook their mental health, and they don't have that like an advocate there to help them go through this process to receive resources. Next slide, honey. So working with the LGBTQ and Two-Spirit communities, you know, I researched the causes of homelessness and why it's dominant against the LGBTQ Two-Spirit community. You know, poverty and economics are, they don't have that stability. So maintaining housing, you know, maintaining their medical needs, mental health needs, it's difficult. And a lot of the times, my clients, they don't have cell phones. So, you know, it's hard to keep in communications with them. And then ethnicity and racism. So racism is a systematic inequality of historical trauma. And a lot of the times I see this with my clients, you know, they're people of color, and being LGBTQ, they have a higher rate of discrimination. So they are victimized, and also plus homelessness, that they have a high chances of hardship and emotional distress. And then also substance abuse. As you see here, it says 40 to 70% of people who are homeless report alcohol and drug dependence, because they come from this traumatic background, and being trafficked add more trauma, and no one taught them healthy coping skills, so they turn to alcohol and drugs. And then also the relationships between homelessness and mental illness. They undermine mental health and mental illnesses, because that's what you see mostly on the streets with our unsheltered relatives. Like, they have behavioral health concerns they haven't addressed, and with the clients I work with, they struggle. Like, they can't maintain a job, and they're addicted. So for me, it's very important that their behavioral health concerns are addressed, and they get that support through a counselor. Next slide, honey. So here I have system failures in early life. A lot of the times, my clients, they expressed to me that when they were younger in their childhood, a majority of them experienced sexual abuse, and they're homeless and they experience high levels of that abuse, like including rape, sexual assault, and sexual victimization. So it's sad. I can't express the heartache I feel for the victims I help, because they grew up being abused, and as an adult they think that's normal, having people take advantage of them. And then of course family breakdowns and unsafe family environments. So with the transgender community I work closely with, they tell me I left the reservation because my family doesn't accept my identity or who I want to be, so I came out to Albuquerque. And then, or they're taken and they're put in foster care. So, and there they are discriminated also, and they just turn to, they run away and they turn to urban areas to try to find some type of hope. But I had a client who mentioned they missed going home to the Navajo reservation, Navajo Nation, and they were telling me that they miss sheep herding with their grandma. And she just had tears in her eyes, and it just made me so sad, just because, their sexual identity, their gender-based identity, that disconnected them from their land, their culture, because of family breakdowns and the unhealthy family dynamics. So, and then it goes into how they're discriminated within their families, which is true. And with my clients, I try to encourage them, like, talking about their culture. Like, I'm Navajo, and when I have a Navajo client, I talk about, I miss helping my parents on the farm, and that, well, their eyes light up, like, oh yeah, I used to do that too. Or if they're from a different tribe, I would say, teach me about your culture, because for me it's important that I want my Native relatives who are victimized by trafficking to remember who they are and where they come from, and to get connected back to their culture. Next slide, honey. So here's survival I put here the hierarchy of needs because as a case manager, as you see at the bottom, physiological needs, which is food, water, warmth, and rest. And as a case manager working with unsheltered relatives on the street, you know, that's the minimum they survive each day is getting food, water, warmth, and rest. And then when they come into our human trafficking programs, our priority is their safety, security needs. So we work really, really hard to try to get them housing or into a safe house. So as you see, it goes up to self-fulfillment needs. And for each of my clients, I wish the best. I wish, they get up on that upper level, but they need support and guidance and of course trust, especially with the LGBTQ two-spirit community. They feel like they're discriminated all the time, but they come to us and we are trauma informed. So it's important for me to have that trust with my clients. So here it says the LGBTQ two-spirit community can be reluctant to use health services and delay seeking help until their condition deteriorates, increasing the risk of hospitalization. And as a case manager, I remember I had a client, she felt that she was going to be judged going into the clinic. So I told her, I said, well, I can go with you. And she loved that ideal. So, I was her advocate the whole time when she was getting her medical needs. And so, they feel like they're judged and, they're not LGBTQ two-spirited, like a safe zone. So for me, I have to be there and advocate for them and make sure, they're comfortable, make sure they know they're in a safe place. And next, sex trafficking victims report significantly higher numbers of clients as well as inconsistent condom use of clients, putting them at greater risk of contracting sexually transmitted infections. And this is the life of our unsheltered relatives. They're being forced to do dates, and they report to me that their trafficker doesn't even provide protection. So they're putting their health at risk. So with First Nations, our medical needs is our first priority to make sure, they are getting the right medical assessments done and just, healing themselves. And the next thing is going into shelters. A lot of our shelters, they don't, it's female and male. So my clients, they would rather stay on the streets than going into shelters because, the gender-based violence, they're beaten, they're violated, and they just don't want to go into shelters. So I feel like, working in this community, we need to somehow address that, making sure these shelters are a safe place because, we have our homeless population is at a large percentage right now in Albuquerque. Next slide. So here you can see we have our street outreaches with First Nations Community Healthsource. So weekly, we participate in street outreaches. And these photos here are pre-COVID. So we would, collaborate with different organizations. We would conduct evening or morning outreaches. So I miss this. I miss, working with other community partners and going out, encountering encampments, homeless encampments, because often they the people in the homeless encampments, they can't make it to different organizations or clinics to get the resources they need. So we do weekly drop-ins at the Transgender Resource Center of New Mexico in our All Nation Wellness and Healing Center. So the All Nation Wellness and Healing Center is our meal site for First Nations. And there, you know, that's where we contact a lot of victims. And we just give them our information because their traffickers are waiting for them. You know, they'll let them go in there to get a meal, but then they have to go back to them. So I just give them our information, and hopefully, you know, they come in and get the resources they need. And then we do collaborate with tribal communities. So we work closely with the Traditional Wellness Program at First Nations. Sometimes we get referrals from them. And then I know we were going to collaborate with the Murdered and Missing Diné relatives and Council Delegate Woman Amber Crotty before COVID happened. So I'm hoping we still continue to do new things with Navajo Nation. And here, you can go to the next slide, honey. So as a direct service provider here at First Nations Community Healthsource, like I said, medical is our priority, and of course safety. Oh, thank you. Oh, can you go back, honey? Yeah. So with our primary care, it's a full range of medical services, and we do have pharmacy services. So when we get a victim who needs medical, we do have urgent and same day care. They can get their immunizations. They have transgender health care, which I am so happy about because my transgender clients, they always ask me if they could get their hormones, and I said yes. So they're happy with our main clinic on Zuni Road. And then also we have our women's health care and men's health care, chronic disease care, family planning and birth control, HIV, STD, and hepatitis C testing, HIV and hepatitis C treatment, and Suboxone treatment, and they do offer. Next slide, honey. And then we do offer dental. So, they serve children, adults, and elders. And with this, they can get exams, x-rays, prosthetics, cleanings, emergency and pain management, and oral surgery services. Next slide. And this one's most important to me, behavioral health. They offer comprehensive and culturally sensitive mental health and substance abuse counseling program. So they do different assessments, and they make sure, the program the client is going to go into is the right program. They have referrals, sexual assault prevention education, alcohol education classes, traditional healing, trauma-informed care, seeking safety groups, adult intensive outpatient substance abuse treatment. So, with behavioral health that incorporates like holistic healing, and with our traditional wellness program, they are offering cedar blessings every Wednesdays. And I think, having that at our clinic helps our Native community. Like I said, the LGBTQ two-spirit, because of their family not being acceptant of who they are, they lose that connection with where they come from. And with the traditional wellness program, having those cedar blessings, they feel happy, and they feel, that they miss being back home. I had a client who participated in the cedar blessing, and she told me, this reminds me of my grandparents so much because of the smell of the smoke. And, I just let her talk. She said she used to herd sheep. She used to help train break-in horses. And so I think for her to vent to me, it was her way of trying to heal. So that's what I love about the Traditional Wellness program, is that they offer those type of services. They do sweat lodge. You do have to provide proof of vaccination for the COVID. But yeah, so I'm a huge supporter of behavioral health. Next slide. So here you have the program I formerly used to lead, Caring to Achieve Resilience and Quality Among Survivors. So we accept referrals from all sources. We do get self-referrals. We do get victims coming in because they hear it from the other clients we serve on the streets. And we do work with partners, families, and friends. So we provide community outreaches, like what I discussed before. We assist survivors, including weekly street and community outreaches, and we have a strong community collaboration, which we create and support. So with the CARES program, it was initially implemented for youth victims because there is not a lot of youth programs out here in Albuquerque that address trafficking. And, there's a huge need for that, especially, trying to develop a shelter or safe houses for, youth victims. And this program, we would work closely with CYFD and the Children Outreach Court. So it's sad due to, not many foster parents, or there's no shelters that accept anyone under 18. They have to be in state custody. So they're in juvenile jail just to keep them safe. So that's what we've seen a lot of with our youth victims. But of course, we take anyone of all ages, and we do work closely with New Mexico Legal Aid. So if they're needing like a protection order, they could provide that. And then we also work with the Attorney General's office. So when we have a victim who wants to talk to law enforcement, we don't turn to APD. We do turn to the detectives that work with the Attorney General's office, because our approach is different than APD. So that's what I like about the detectives. Next slide. And here you have the CARE Sister program, which is EAST. So that's Education and Advocacy Against Sex Trafficking program. So with this program, they support Native American and Alaska Native victims of sex trafficking in Albuquerque and surrounding tribal communities. And they do provide the same services as CARES. They do advocacy, prevention, education, and essential case management services. So with this program, again, it was implemented to serve different tribal communities and to help Native American victims here in Albuquerque, but they do take anyone and anyone of all ages. And let's see here, I did put their contact number on there. So, that's the sister program of CARES at First Nations Community Healthsource. Next slide. With First Nations, we have different case management programs. So each program, we are survivor-centered to address their care needs. And we're not limited, but we do, as you see here, we do offer medical, dental, behavioral health, cultural wellness, traditional healing, housing referrals, food, identification card, legal, transportation, employment, vision, protection, safety, planning, education, social services, translation, and immigration. And most of the time, the clients we serve, they are in need of housing, and that is very difficult process. So our, of course, our priorities are their health, their housing, and their mental health. That is our major, concerns for our clients. But we had a lot of success with housing a lot of our clients, and they're doing well. So I'm happy about that. Can do next slide, honey. So resources for direct service providers. It's important for us to support our victims and guide them to the right resources, because oftentimes victims, they face physical and mental health issues relating to their situation. And then victims often need emergency food, clothing, shelter, translation services, legal services. And then, so with that, for being a direct service provider, it's important to get them the right resources because it's very critical to the recovery. And you see here, I don't think I listed all of it, but these are the community partners we work closely with in Albuquerque. So we have the Dream Center, we do have LifeLink, and right now I think those are the only two organizations that have safe houses. And then you have the 505 Get Free. Victims or advocates can call that number, and then they can guide you to the right resources also. And we do work with New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness. That's where we send our housing referrals. And like I said, it's a hard process to obtain housing for our clients. It's hard work, but it's rewarding to see them in their own, their own space, their own homes that they can, feel safe instead of being on the streets. Next slide. So with what I talked about earlier, these are my sources I used. But, like Jolene said, I'm joining the coalition as the Sex Trafficking Project Coordinator. I am going to miss my clients, and I know they're doing well, but we do have our sister program, the East program. They're fully staffed, so if you need to contact them for a relative or someone that needs help in case management, you can find their info at fnch.org, and it would be under the Sex Trafficking program, and it's called East. So thank you for letting me share my knowledge as a direct service provider. So I think we're going to do Q&As later. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Michele. Really appreciate you giving us some insight in terms of direct services. So with that, we'd like to open it up to folks who may have questions or any comments for our presenters that you'd like to share. We can go ahead and do that now.
Hi, my name is Norma Shelbu. I'm with Child Haven in Farmington, New Mexico. And we always are looking for different ways to teach different things for some of our employees. Are you guys open to teaching or scheduling something for employees or people?
Speaking for myself and SBI, yes, we do give presentations, and we do have a speaking fee for organizations who are trying to learn directly from survivors. So if you're having our Survivors Leadership Council speak, that speaking fee would go directly to them as speakers. Or if it's a staff member from SBI, that would go back to support our direct services to clients. But we do provide those presentations on request.
Okay, great, thank you.
That's a great question, Norma. Michele will be joining our team on Monday, and we'll be looking at ways to update some of the content we have in terms of sex sex trafficking. And we can certainly provide, if you need a presentation or more information, Honey will drop our email in there. We also have a presentation request form that folks can utilize if you're needing more education in the areas of trafficking. I want to thank Annita and Michele for coming in today into this space to give us more information on trafficking, what that looks like in tribal communities, what services are out there, and resources that folks will have access to. And also want to extend my thanks to staff who helped support it with the logistics of this event, Curtis and Honey. Thank you so much for providing the support that we needed today. And have a great day, everyone. Be safe.